Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on future deep dives. Today, we're heading north to a region that's becoming a real geopolitical hotspot, the Arctic. Now, whether you're a UPSC aspirant, a student of international relations, or just someone who wants to understand what's happening in the world, this one's for you. We're going beyond those headlines and try to understand the Arctic Council.
Absolutely. It's way more than just polar bears and melting ice caps, although those are definitely important. We're going to dive deep into how this whole region is governed, look at the resource interests and these challenges that are popping up that are making the Arctic kind of a focal point in global affairs.
It really is. So imagine this. It's 1996. Cold War's over. And countries are looking for ways to cooperate, especially in places that are facing environmental challenges. That's where the Arctic Council comes in. It was born out of something called the 1996 Ottawa Declaration. And it's basically a forum where all these Arctic nations come together to figure out, the future of this region.
And what's fascinating is that it's not just about protecting the environment, although that's a big part of it, but also promoting sustainable development. So you got to think about the indigenous communities, the economic activities, and of course preserving this, incredibly fragile ecosystem.
Right, it's like a giant balancing act.
Yeah.
And speaking of balancing, let's talk about who's actually involved. Because the Arctic Council isn't like your typical international organization. They've got this three-tiered membership structure.
Yeah, it's a bit like a sports team. With different levels of involvement, you have the 8 Arctic states at the core. That's Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Russia, Sweden, and the United States. They're the ones really setting the agenda and having the final say. But what makes it different is the inclusion of permanent participants, 6 indigenous groups that have a stake in the Arctic's future.
Now, this is huge, especially if you're following global governance trends for the UPSC. These permanent participants aren't just there for show. They have a real voice in every decision the council makes. It's all about making sure that the people who are most affected by these policies are actually considered.
And then there's the third tier, observers. This is where it gets really interesting. This is where you have countries like India, China, and tons of international organizations all trying to get a seat at the table.
Wait a minute, India and China
Yeah.
in the Arctic? That sounds a little strange. Why would they even care about something that's happening thousands of miles away?
Well, it's all about how the Arctic is changing. With climate change melting the ice and opening up new shipping routes, the Arctic is becoming more accessible for resource extraction and trade. And countries like India and China, they see both opportunities and challenges in this new landscape.
Okay, so we've got this really diverse group of players with different interests, all trying to navigate this complex geopolitical landscape. But how does the Arctic Council actually get things done? It's not just, meeting after meeting and fancy declarations, right?
No, not at all. The real work happens through these 6 specialized working groups, each one focused on a specific area, like monitoring pollution, assessing climate change impacts, or figuring out how to manage marine resources sustainably.
So for those of you studying for the UPSC, pay attention here. The Arctic Council isn't just symbolic. It actually has teeth. They take research and concerns and turn them into recommendations, and sometimes even legally binding agreements.
They have. The Arctic Council has facilitated 3 legally binding agreements so far. One is about search and rescue, which is super important in that environment. Another one's about preparing for oil spills, given the potential for more resource extraction. And the third one is about international scientific cooperation, which is really important to understand this complex ecosystem.
This is where it gets really interesting, especially if you're into environmental issues and international law. These agreements show that the Arctic Council can actually get things done and make countries change their behavior.
It also shows a big difference between the Arctic and Antarctica. Unlike Antarctica, which has one big treaty, the Arctic doesn't have that.
So it's more like a patchwork system with national laws, international agreements, and of course the Arctic Council all playing a role in how this really important region is governed.
And that lack of a single treaty really makes the Arctic Council super important. It's the main place where states can get together, figure out challenges, and try to, prevent the Arctic from becoming a conflict zone.
Right. Which brings us to the big issue. The Arctic isn't just this pristine wonderland. It's also got tons of untapped resources. We're talking oil, natural gas, minerals, and even potential new shipping routes as the ice melts.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic. Climate change, which is a huge threat to the Arctic, is also opening it up for economic activity. And that's where things get a little tense geopolitically.
All right. Pop quiz for all you UPSC preppers out there.
Yeah.
Which country has been making waves, literally, with their icebreakers and Arctic ambitions, kind of raising eyebrows among the other Arctic nations?
You got it, China. Even though they aren't an Arctic state, they've called themselves a near Arctic state, and they've been investing in infrastructure, research, you name it. They even have this term, the Polar Silk Road, for how they see the Arctic developing.
So it's not just about the resources, it's about who controls them, who gets access, and, strategic positioning in a region that's becoming more and more important globally.
Exactly. And this is where India enters the picture. Remember those observers we were talking about? Well, India got that status back in 2013, and they've been getting more and more involved.
Now, some of you might be thinking, why would India care? They're thousands of miles away from the Arctic. Well, this is where it gets interesting. India's got multiple reasons for being interested in the Arctic. First, there's the science part. Climate change in the Arctic affects weather everywhere, including India's monsoon season, which is super important for their agriculture and their economy.
Yeah, and India has been doing research in the Arctic for over a decade now. They've got a research station in Svalbard, Norway. They're studying everything from glaciers to how climate change affects the ecosystem. All this data helps them understand these global changes.
So they're not just talking, they're actually doing the work to understand what's going on.
Exactly. And then there's the economic side of things. Access to new shipping routes, like the Northern Sea Route, could save India a lot of time and money when it comes to getting their goods to Europe.
It's like finding a shortcut on your way to work. Less time, less gas, and potentially lots of economic benefits.
And of course, you can't forget about the strategic side of things. With China getting more involved in the Arctic, it makes things a little complicated for India, especially given, their history.
Yeah, it's kind of like a chess game where every move affects the balance of power.
Mm.
So how does India, as an observer, make sure they're heard in all of this?
It's a tough balance. On the one hand, they got to participate, contribute to the working groups, and show that they're committed to the Arctic's future.
Basically, show up, do the work, and be a good team player.
Right. But they also have to be vocal about their own interests and concerns. They can't just sit back and let others make decisions that could affect them.
So they need to speak up and make sure their perspective is part of the conversation. It's a tricky situation, but it seems like India is doing a pretty good job so far.
And it's not just India. All the players, from the Arctic states to the indigenous groups and the observers, are trying to figure out how to govern this area that's changing so fast.
It's like trying to steer a ship through a place you've never been, with icebergs everywhere and the weather changing all the time. It's a real challenge. So we've got this region that's changing constantly, all these different interests, and this organization trying to, keep everything under control. What happens next? Can the Arctic Council handle all this pressure and still be the main way the Arctic is governed?
That's the big question. The Arctic Council definitely has some serious challenges ahead, and whether or not it can adapt will determine if it stays relevant. I think one of the biggest things is keeping the Arctic states working together, especially with, the geopolitical tensions that are going on.
Yeah, it's tough, like trying to get 8 roommates to agree on anything,
Mm-hmm.
especially when some of those roommates are major world powers.
Exactly. The council has to make decisions by consensus, so just one member can stop everything. That can make it really hard to get things done, especially when everyone has different priorities. And then there's the whole issue of balancing resource development and protecting the environment.
Yeah, it's that classic problem, the economy versus the planet. How do you find that balance in a place as fragile as the Arctic?
That's where those working groups and all their research comes in. They provide the data, the assessments, and the recommendations to help make good decisions. It's about finding ways to develop resources responsibly with minimal environmental impact and making sure the benefits are shared fairly.
And we can't forget about the indigenous people who live there. They have to be part of the conversation. In fact, they should be leading the way in shaping the Arctic's future.
I agree. The Arctic Council is actually a good example of how to include indigenous perspectives in decision-making. Other organizations could learn a lot from them.
So there you have it, the Arctic Council. This unique example of international cooperation facing huge challenges in a world that's changing faster than ever. Whether you're preparing for the UPSC, studying global affairs, or just someone who cares about the planet, keep an eye on the Arctic.
It's a place where the environment and geopolitics are colliding, where the future of entire cultures is at stake, and where decisions made today will have consequences for a long time.
And that wraps up our deep dive into the Arctic Council. We hope you have a better understanding of this really interesting and complex region.
Remember, knowledge is power, so keep learning, keep exploring, and don't be afraid to ask the tough questions.
And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the world of global affairs. Until then, stay curious and keep diving deep.